The engine died with a wheeze that echoed how my bank account felt. For a moment, I just sat there in the silence, staring at the massive structure ahead my new home. Apparently, the lodge looked like a luxury ski resort that had been abandoned. For decades, huge timber beams framed the structure. Wide windows stared out into the woods like lifeless eyes, and yet, something about its proportions felt wrong, like it had been designed for people just a bit larger than normal. Before I could even grab my bag, the front door creaked open and out stepped a man who looked like he belonged in a corporate boardroom rather than the middle of the Canadian wilderness. Pressed shirt, polished shoes, immaculate hair. "You must be Randy," he said, walking over with a firm handshake. "I'm Peter Fitzgerald, but call me Paul. Peter's too stuffy for this place." I thanked him for the opportunity and introduced myself, still wincing from the handshake. For days on the road, in a beat-up car, had left me exhausted and uneasy. The surroundings were breathtaking, endless trees, distant mountains, and absolute isolation. Paul gave me a brief tour of the lodge. Inside, it was even more unsettling than outside. Everything was oversized doorways, wide enough for a fridge, ceilings vanishing into shadow, and endless hallways that seemed to stretch into infinity. Paul kept up a running commentary, but subtly guided me away from certain doors and stairways, without explanation. "Kitchen's fully stocked," he said, revealing rows of canned goods. "You'll be doing your own cooking. The work schedule doesn't allow for meal breaks." I asked again what the actual work entailed. Something I had asked several times over the phone without ever getting a clear answer. "Maintenance," he said vaguely. "Monitoring systems. We have some unique facilities that require overnight supervision." Upstairs, my room was simpler bed, a dresser, and a window barred with what might have passed for decorative ironwork. When I asked about the last guy who held the job, Paul simply said he found something better and moved on. Downstairs, in the main lounge, he quoted a salary that was much higher than what he'd mentioned previously. "Hazard pay," he explained. When I asked what kind of hazard, he dismissed it with a smile. "Isolation, night shifts can be hard on some people." He handed me a thick envelope labeled House Rules and told me to memorize them. The paper felt heavy in my hands. "How many rules?" I asked. "Enough," he replied, and said we needed to go meet the townspeople. The drive into town was winding and disorienting. Paul kept his eyes on the road and spoke in clipped tones. "Don't bring anyone from town back to the lodge. Not ever." When I asked why, he only said, "They don't mix well with the work environment." More strange warnings followed. "Never give them alcohol. Don't offer them rides. If they ask for help, say no. Always." I pushed for more details, but Paul clammed up. "This job isn't for everyone," he said finally. "The last 3 didn't work out." "What happened to them?" I asked. "They didn't follow the rules." My stomach turned. The town was small, quiet, and strange. As we walked, people watched us from behind curtains, and those we passed moved just a bit oddly, too smooth, too synchronized. Paul introduced me to a few key figures. Catherine Miles ran the local clinic. "Closest thing to a doctor we've got," he said. Turner's Bar was next, its windows tinted pitch black. "Don't worry if Donald Turner doesn't say much," Paul told me. "He's reliable." We returned to the lodge before dark. My first shift began that night. When Paul finally left, I pulled the rulebook from my pocket. At the top, Lodge. Operational guidelines, mandatory compliance. It was 23 pages long. Rule 1. Keep doors locked from sunset to sunrise. Rule 2. Do not respond to knocking, calling, or any noises from outside. Rule 3. Basement is off limits. Rule 4. Second floor east wing, especially room 7, is off limits. Rule 5. Cover all kitchen windows before dark. It went on like that, dozens of don'ts. One rule hit me hardest. If townspeople appear to be injured or in distress during night hours, do not provide assistance. I covered the windows and sat in the monitoring room. The screens showed various camera feeds, forest paths, the driveway, the porch. The logbook was filled with entries from previous workers. One entry stood out. Day 73. They're getting more sophisticated. Catherine sounded exactly like my sister tonight. The voice modulation is unreal. Another read found more scratches at the basement door. Paul says it's psychological conditioning, but it doesn't feel like that when you hear you're dead. Mother's voice at 3 a.m. Most entries ended abruptly within a few weeks. Only Paul's had gone on for years. As I sat in silence, a knock came at the front door. I froze. The camera showed a woman in a torn white nurse's uniform. Blood soaked her shoulder. "Please," she called out. "I've been in an accident." Her voice was soft, pained, desperate. "I just need to call for help." She looked just like Catherine from the clinic. Exactly like her. She pressed her face to the window, peering inside. "I know someone's in there. Please." I remembered the rule, no responding to sounds from outside. My hand hovered over the door control, instincts at war with protocol. She said she had a concussion. She sounded terrified, but her movements, they were too fluid, too precise for someone who'd just been in a crash. I stayed still and watched. Her voice grew weaker. "Please, I'm bleeding. I don't want to die out here." Then silence. She didn't leave. She just stood there, still waiting. The radio buzzed. Paul's voice came through faintly. "Randy, you there?" I answered, hesitating. "Some of these rules seem extreme," I told him. "What am I protecting this place from?" After a long pause, he replied, "The people in town, they're not what they used to be. Side effects, behavioral, physical, not dangerous, but unpredictable. The rules are there for a reason. Don't make mistakes." The signal cut out. Alone in the dark, the hum of electronics was my only companion. I opened the logbook. Day 1, I wrote, "Night shift begins. All systems normal." A howl echoed in the distance, too long, too layered, like several voices harmonizing. I added, "Unusual wildlife sounds noted. Investigation not recommended." I turned back to the rules, reading more carefully now. I had a feeling I'd need to know them by heart. Her voice cracked with what sounded like real desperation, trembling as she said she was scared and that something was wrong with her vision. The way she touched her forehead, like checking for a wound, made it almost believable. Almost, but I stayed in the chair, remembering Paul's warning about this exact scenario. Catherine took a step back from the window and stared straight into the camera. Her eyes briefly shimmered in the infrared light like an animal's would. Then she smiled, and I noticed her teeth too sharp, too unnatural. She spoke again, her voice lower now, guttural, almost growling, as she said she could hear my heartbeat from outside. That shouldn't have been possible. The lodge walls were thick, and she was too far away unless she had some sort of advanced listening device. She began circling the building, always staying just within range of the surveillance cameras. Her movements had shifted entirely. Earlier, She had looked panicked and injured. Now she glided like a predator, placing each step with inhuman precision despite the squeaky white nursing shoes. Her voice followed me through the speakers, now altered by some voice modulation tech that gave her a mechanical undertone. She pressed her hands to every window, looking in, whispering that I couldn't stay hidden forever, that I'd eventually slip up. Her nails were long, filed into points that gleamed under the moonlight. She talked about the last guy who worked here, said he lasted 3 months. Marcus, she called him. He was stubborn too, played by the rules. But everyone breaks eventually, she said, like it was just a matter of time. I sat frozen, clutching the desk, reminding myself it was all a test. Part of some psychological conditioning exercise Paul had told me about. It had to be costumes, props, technology fake, but the fear it instilled, that was real. She made it worse by talking like we were old friends, reminiscing about Marcus like he was family. Told me he opened the door on day 87, pressed her face against the glass and asked if I wanted to know what happened to him. I didn't, not even a little. Her laugh scratched through the speakers like shards of glass. She said he was still here, part of the community now. Family. She kept at it for an hour. Sometimes she disappeared completely from the cameras and reappeared in a different spot. Sometimes she just stood outside the same window for 15 minutes straight, not moving at all. And sometimes she'd speak in that same friendly nurse voice I'd heard in town before, only to switch back into something monstrous. Her appearance didn't help either. She still looked perfectly normal, if you didn't look too hard at her eyes or the way her body moved, like it had been dislocated and reset. She could have passed for any nurse making house calls. The blood on her uniform, the concern in her face when she let it show, all seemed authentic. Around 2 a.m., she left. One moment she was at the front door, the next she was gone. The cameras showed nothing but the quiet road and forest beyond. I stayed awake until sunrise, watching every screen, jumping at every creak and rattle. When dawn broke, I felt like I'd aged a decade. At 7 a.m., Paul radioed in. His voice was a lifeline. I told him Catherine showed up and that I didn't. Open the door. He congratulated me, asked what I thought of her performance. I realized then it had all been a test. But when I mentioned the voice modulation, there was a long pause. Paul's response was vague. Right, training, he said. He told me we'd talk when he got back at 9 a.m. I called the town clinic. Catherine answered, cheerful and bright. No accidents, no injuries. Claimed she'd been home all night. It was the same voice, but somehow different. I was left wondering if she was lying or if whatever had been at the lodge last night wasn't her at all. Paul returned at noon. I told him everything. He listened, then nodded. I had done better than most, he said. He led me to a padlocked door near the laundry room. Inside was a storage space filled with boxes labeled with names and dates. Marcus Chen, Sarah Williams, David Rodriguez. Each box held someone's life clothes, photos, personal belongings. Paul opened Marcus' box and handed me his journal. At first, Marcus wrote like anyone would, complaints about isolation, notes about the odd locals, questions about the job. But as the days passed, the entries turned frantic. He talked about Catherine sounding like his ex-wife. He questioned how they knew personal details. On day 52, someone called to him in his dead father's voice. Day 67, he started doubting that it was technology at all. By day 81, he was finding claw marks near the basement. The last entry mentioned hearing his dead mother call his name. At 3 a.m., I asked Paul what happened to Marcus. He said Marcus stopped believing it was fake, and then he made a mistake. Paul returned the journal to the box and said the job was about more than maintenance. It was about learning to separate reality from illusion. The people in town weren't what they seemed, but neither were they what Marcus feared. The truth lay somewhere in between. That night, I opened the logbook and wrote, Day 2, still following the rules. I saw movement in the woods against something, walking upright, coming closer. The next morning, I drove to town. I needed answers. Turner's bar was dim and quiet. Locals stared as I walked in. Their teeth, their nails, the shimmer in their eyes, it was all too familiar. Donald Turner greeted me like he'd been expecting me. They mentioned Marcus again, casually, like it was common knowledge at the general store. I met Lily. She was different. Her eyes were human. She warned me to stop joking about the townspeople. She said the lodge didn't just monitor, it processed, changed people slowly through food, air, and water. By the time they noticed, it was too late. Catherine walked in, her uniform spotless. Lily recoiled. Catherine smiled, talked about community and rules, then reminded Lily about her departure. Timeline. After she left, Lily explained. The lodge wasn't alone, there were others. Transfers happened. Integration was the end goal. Marcus had tried to escape, then tried to warn others. That was when they decided he was ready. Where is he now? Still here, part of the community. Lily wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and said I had probably already seen him during my night shifts. One of the figures moving between the trees, one of the voices calling out in the dark. That was Marcus, the previous lodge worker, the same Marcus who left behind a journal full of increasingly desperate notes and a box of personal items, still sitting on a shelf in the locked closet of failed employees. The room felt like it was tilting under my feet. My stomach churned at the thought that one of those shadows out there, one of those pleading voices using the names of my loved ones, wasn't just some actor or impersonator. It was someone who used to be like me. I asked her why she was telling me all of this. Her answer was quiet and unnerving, because I seemed different. Most people who adapt quickly to life at the lodge are already broken, she said. People who are looking for a place to vanish into. But I wasn't broken. I was just running. From a ruined career, from my mother's death, from the failure to hold anything in my life together. She looked at me with something like pity and told me I wasn't ready to disappear yet. I asked her what made her different. Lily said she had volunteered, believing she was helping with medical research. Her laugh was sharp, bitter, and she admitted she was just another subject, helping them refine their process. But for some reason, the modifications hadn't taken completely. She retained too much of herself. That, she explained, is why she was being transferred, which she clarified really meant eliminated. I wanted to protest, but she shut me down with a look and a simple fact. Even if she could escape, she'd been changed too much to survive. Outside, her hand brushed her throat, revealing faint surgical scars. The modifications weren't only in the mind, they were physical, permanent. Then the bell above the shop door rang, and through the window I saw a group of townspeople, gathering silently. Not threatening, just ... watching. Lily urged me to leave. They didn't like new workers spending too much time with her. I asked if there was anything I could do to help. Her advice was simple: follow the rules, pretend I didn't know, and above all, don't trust Paul completely. I left town with a head full of questions and a heart pounding with dread. Back at the lodge, Paul was unloading groceries with his usual clinical efficiency. He asked me how town was, and I answered carefully, mentioning that the townspeople seemed invested in the lodge's operations. He smiled and said the community takes the research very seriously. Everyone has a role to play. When I asked what kind of research, he said adaptive biology and human enhancement, things that required isolation and control. He promised I'd see the underground facilities. Once I'd proven reliable, most workers are given access within a month, assuming they're committed to staying. That night, I sat in front of the monitors, trying to make sense of it all. I thought about Lily, about Marcus, about the voices that had been calling from the darkness. None of it felt like a test anymore. It was a slow transformation, a soft corruption wrapped in procedures and protocol. I stared at the blank page of the logbook and wrote, Day 4, beginning to understand the real job requirements. Then the voices came again. It started with Sarah, not someone pretending to be Sarah, but her exact voice. Every nuance, every rasp, every syllable pronounced exactly the way she did. She begged me to let her in. She said she drove out to find me and that she was scared. Through the front door camera, I saw Donald Turner on the porch, his big frame unmistakable. But when he spoke, it was Sarah's voice that came out. Then Catherine began circling the lodge with 3 others, and from her mouth came my mother's voice. Not just the sound of it, but the emotional cadence, the exact way she'd mix Spanish and English when she was pleading. Then my father's voice joined from the back of the building. Each voice carried a personal weight I wasn't prepared for. They used private moments, personal memories, intimate details no one should know. They knew everything, jokes, fights, regrets, things I hadn't told anyone. The voices changed tactics around 2 in the morning. They began sharing good memories, first dates, graduations, childhood moments. But buried within the nostalgia were more invasive details, things even I barely remembered until they said them aloud. At 3, it stopped. The cameras showed nothing, but I heard scratching from the basement. I'd never been down there, but the sounds metal against claws drew me in. I opened the door and descended into darkness. What I found wasn't a storage area, it was a facility. The basement was all steel and concrete, with biohazard signs and warnings in multiple languages. At the far end stood a door, industrial, sealed, marked with contamination protocols. Something was behind it. Breathing, then a voice spoke. My own voice. It told me I shouldn't be down here. It mimicked my tone, my nervous stutter. The voice told me I was talking to myself. Then more breathing, multiple people now. I backed away, heart pounding. On the ventilation system, I saw tubes leading from the sealed area to the rest of the lodge. Whatever was behind that door was part of the lodge's life support. When Paul returned the next morning, I confronted him. I told him I'd heard voices. He said their research was thorough. Background checks, psychology profiles, social media. Then I mentioned the basement. His face changed. I told him what I'd seen, and he simply said that the basement housed experimental research equipment. When I asked about Lily, he paused, then said she was gone. Left during the night, he claimed. It was expected. I asked how it was expected. He said people who ask too many questions don't last. Then he looked at me and told me we needed to talk about my integration timeline. My training was progressing faster than most, he said. Soon, I'd be ready for the next phase. I asked him, Integration into what? He just said, into the community, into my permanent role here. And then he added, the psychological conditioning phase is almost complete. That night, I sat at the monitoring station with a growing sense that my time as an observer was coming to an end. The facility in the basement, the unnervingly advanced voice technology, the townspeople's escalating boldness, none of it pointed to a passive job anymore. I opened the logbook and initially wrote a dry, clinical entry. Day 5, basement facility discovered. Psychological conditioning intensifying. Subject approaching readiness for next phase. Then I scratched it out and replaced it with what felt truer. Day 5, running out of time. The forest outside was silent, but I knew the townspeople were out there preparing for something. And behind that thick steel door in the basement, something was waiting. It felt less and less like I had a choice in what came next. Paul was already in the kitchen when I came down, pouring coffee like it was any other morning, but something about him was different. Not obvious at first glance, but I'd become attuned to the smallest shifts. His canine teeth looked sharper, his movements more fluid, almost unnatural. When he turned to look at me, I caught the faint reflective shimmer in his eyes that hadn't been there before. I told him we needed to talk about everything. The lodge, the town, the people, the basement. I'd reached a point where I couldn't pretend anymore. Paul studied me for a long moment and then asked what I thought was going on. I laid it out. Plainly, I believed the towns people were not what they appeared to be, that the lodge was far more than a monitoring station, and that he'd been lying to me since day one. He didn't deny any of it. In fact, he laughed, but the sound came out warped, like several voices were tangled together. Then he said I was right and asked if I was ready for the truth. He explained everything. The facility had been operational for 15 years. Officially, it was researching human enhancement and adaptive biology. In reality, it was running illegal experiments on unwilling subjects. Some townspeople had volunteered at first. Others, like me, had been selected based on psychological profiles. The modifications weren't genetic, he said. They were surgical, augmented with pharmaceuticals and technology. Dental implants, sharpened teeth. Bone structure was altered surgically. Reflective contact lenses gave the eyes that inhuman gleam. Voice modulation devices were embedded in the throat. Even the smooth, fluid movements were a result of joint modification and muscle enhancement. The voice mimicry, the thing that haunted me most, was a blend of high-level psychological profiling and synthetic voice tech. They'd been watching me for a long time, long before I arrived. My car hadn't broken down by accident. Paul told me it was disabled deliberately, using a remote EMP device. They made sure I'd end up here with no way to leave. My entire presence was engineered. My psychological profile flagged me as ideal for their process. When I asked what the process was preparing me for, Paul didn't hesitate. Compliance. Everything at the lodge was about conditioning recruits until they were ready to accept modification and become part of the operation. I asked how long the conditioning took, and Paul said most people were ready within 2 to 4 weeks. I'd only been there 6 days, and I was already ahead of schedule. He said it made me a perfect candidate for the next stage, integration. Some people were turned into recruiters, others into administrators. Many just joined the townspeople. But refusal, he admitted, wasn't really an option. I stood, reeling. And then Paul said something that shook me. He claimed to be undercover, part of a federal bioethics task force, gathering evidence of the facility's crimes. To prove it, he removed his prosthetics teeth, lenses, and his face returned to something more human. He told me the town's people weren't evil. Most were victims like me. Some still had their memories, their sense of self, but were too changed to leave. I asked about Lily. He said she tried to warn others, that she retained too much of herself after the procedures. So they transferred. Hermaby killed her. The Lily I'd spoken to, the one who tried to help me, was gone. Paul said he needed more time to finish gathering evidence, and that the administrators were accelerating my processing. He gave me a small device to wear that would block the compliance drugs in the air. It fit in my ear and immediately cleared a fog I hadn't realized was there. That evening, I watched the monitors with new eyes. I understood now that the cameras were watching me just as much as I was watching the town. I wrote in the logbook. Again, day 6. Subjects maintaining excellent adaptation. Recommend acceleration of integration timeline. It was a lie, but I knew someone else would be reading it. When I found Paul the next morning, he was packing. I asked where he was going. He said he was leaving the next day and that it was time I took over. That scared me more than anything. He led me to the basement again and used a keycard to open. The steel door, what lay beyond, was not storage or machinery, it was a laboratory, stark white, full of monitors, brain scans, medical chairs with restraints, and surgical tools laid out in neat rows. This, he said, was where the future was being built. The modifications offered real benefits: faster healing, better senses, radiation resistance. He spoke like a believer. I realized then that Paul might have once been a federal agent, but he wasn't anymore. The line between spy and convert had long since blurred. He showed me my medical file. My body had already changed more than I thought, stronger, faster, sharper. I'd been dosed every day, modified gradually, without my knowledge. When I asked again about Lily, he gave the same answer. She interfered, she became a threat, and threats were removed. Then he offered me a choice: complete the procedure voluntarily and become a supervisor, or have my memories erased and be released. He said I could go back to my old life, unaware of any of this. I stared at the surgical chair, the instruments, the tanks of chemical agents, and tried to imagine waking up on the other side of that process. The decision would define everything that came next: enhanced or erased, survivor or ghost. Joining the network meant becoming part of something inhuman, yet refusing meant losing everything, including my memory. Paul stood there, calmly laying it all out: how hundreds had come through this place, how some became recruiters, others administrators. The network was growing, he said, with facilities across the country, all working toward a common goal: creating an army of modified humans, a species that could endure the coming catastrophes. Climate disasters, war, collapse. Paul believed regular humans wouldn't survive, but modified ones might. As I listened, I remembered the eerie way the townspeople moved, how they seemed to float more than walk, their reflexes too perfect. When I questioned their humanity, Paul dismissed it. Humanity is a luxury we can't afford. Choice is an illusion when extinction is the alternative, he told me. Then he showed me data, screens filled with profiles and progress metrics. According to him, I'd already started to change. My reflexes were sharper, senses heightened. Even if I walked away, the modifications had begun. He said I had until morning. If I agreed to the transformation, it would start immediately. If I refused, they'd erase my memory and drop me at a hospital in Phoenix. But then what? My past identity would vanish. I'd be Randy Garza no more, just a new name in a system, working to recruit others into the same hell I'd been dragged into, and Paul insisted I'd be valuable. My background in journalism gave me skills in reading people, making connections. I'd be perfect at identifying potential recruits. But was that just dressing up a lie? I'd be doing to others what had been done to me as he left the lab. I sat there, surrounded by medical chairs and screens, displaying logs of countless others processed before me. I thought of Lily eliminated, or so he said. The townspeople, once just eerie figures, were now part of this silent, complicit machine. I went back upstairs and sat at the monitoring station, watching the forest outside, knowing those eyes. And the trees were no longer putting on a show. They were watching me, waiting to see if I'd become one of them. Then the alarms began blaring, flashing red lights, screens spitting out emergency alerts, containment breach. I was trying to decide my fate, and now the decision was being hijacked. The front door swung open without ceremony. I reached for the radio, but froze when I saw who entered. Catherine Miles. Her posture, her voice, everything about her was suddenly human. No performance, no predator grace, just urgency. Behind her, Donald Turner followed, equally natural in his demeanor. Catherine spoke first. Paul had lied. Lily wasn't eliminated. She'd been transferred for being too empathetic post-transformation. But yesterday, they discovered she had been sending messages trying to warn me. They killed her. Donald's voice was laced with fury as he revealed the truth. No one who learned the truth ever got to walk away. There was no memory wipe, only death or transformation. My choice had never been real. Catherine examined me with medical precision. My body was already changed, cellular structure altered. I wasn't human anymore. Not fully. More footage came up on the monitor's. Marcus Chen, dragged to a chair and forcibly modified after resisting. His eyes, post-procedure, were hollow, lifeless. Donald said some people adapted better than others, but all ended the same. The ones who clung to their identity were either killed or disappeared, and those who conformed, they became like Paul. Recruiters, chemical smells were rising. The lockdown would release toxic gas through the entire facility in minutes. We had only one chance to stop this. Catherine explained that the system would automatically upload all facility data to their private network. But if we could that upload to law enforcement agencies, we could expose everything. The control room was in the basement beyond the laboratory. We had to act fast. As we descended, the air filled with smoke. Emergency lights bathed the corridor in red. We passed empty medical chairs still bearing the marks of their last occupants. Tanks of chemicals hissed, monitors flickered. Then Paul appeared, disheveled and desperate. But instead of hostility, his face showed relief. He wasn't who he said he was. Not an administrator, not even a loyal recruiter. He'd been sabotaging the facility for months. He showed us the data upload in progress. He too had been processed, lied to, promised help for his dying wife. They used him instead. He explained the modifications real permanent, but the monstrous visuals were theater. Catherine and Donald had exaggerated their behavior to buy people like me more time to question the transformation, to delay acceptance. Paul said Lily died trying to help me see through the illusion. The upload ticked toward completion. Alarms shrieked louder. We didn't have long. Catherine led us through a hidden exit, the facility groaning behind us. Paul's sabotage had triggered full destruction as we emerged into the pre-dawn forest. He revealed the truth about the modifications. Permanent, powerful, but not a death sentence for our humanity. We could still choose what to become. We reached his hidden truck and drove away as the lodge exploded behind us, lighting up the valley like a funeral pyre. I watched the place vanish in flame, thinking of Lily's warnings, Marcus's fate, and the hundreds processed before me. My old life was over, but my skills, my instincts as a journalist had prepared me for this. We weren't just running, we were regrouping. Paul had contacts in Nevada, where another facility operated. We'd go there next, try to expose the next node in the network. Catherine said we'd stay connected, help others who escaped, build a resistance. As the smoke thinned behind us and the road stretched ahead, I realized I hadn't lost everything. I had been given tools, strength, speed, healing. I wasn't human anymore, but I wasn't a monster either. Not yet. That would be determined by what I did next.